to talk about the government and politics in the Russian Federation. So, beginning with Russian age of democratization, basically modern Russia, like post-Soviet Union, Russia area stuff. So, Boris Yeltsin, first president of Russia, during his time in office, there was a lot of what is called shock therapy, a lot of selling of the state-owned companies that during the Soviet Union. Those state-owned companies were sold to private individuals, which those private individuals got a lot of wealth from these companies, and then they became the oligarchs. Following his presidency, there was, and there currently is, Vladimir Putin as the president of Russia, and for a brief 4-year gap between Vladimir Putin's time in office as president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev controlled presidency, was elected in 2008, and served until Putin came back into office following the election of 2012. So looking now at Russia as a whole throughout history and how the government came to be, the power and authority during the time of the Soviet Union, there was this idea of nomenklatura, which was basically local Soviets would work their way up in Soviet society towards, in your way up the party towards a higher government office. And rather than just you go from a local area to more of a national area as you worked your way up. The Tsars, basically similar to emperors and such, the main rulers of Russia until the Soviet Union. Marxism-Leninism was one of the main pieces of legitimacy for the Soviet Union, which controlled Russia and a bunch of other modern countries from around around the 1920s to around 1991. There was democratic centralism, which was another main way that was looked at how Russia should be ruled, how the Soviet Union should be ruled. This is how things are to happen. Stalinism was something which did take place in the Soviet Union from really early on in the country's history until the death of Joseph Stalin. Basically, the Stalinism, authoritarian way, tight grip on control of the country, and a lot of totalitarianism in that. And then from modern Russia, the Constitution of 1993 gives a lot of the rules and some legitimacy to the modern Russian state. The Duma is the main legislative body that can propose laws. It is the lower house in the legislature of Russia. The upper house is the Federation Council, but the Duma is elected by the people of Russia to create laws. There's a lot of cultural heterogeneity as Russia expanded more towards the east. There's a lot more cultures rather than people just think of ethnic Russians in Russia. There's a lot more cultures which exist in Russia, and it grew as the country expanded eastward. Tsar Peter the Great, one of those early Tsars that really tried to connect Russia with the Western world, or I should say Western Europe, and went to a lot of countries in Europe to try to look at how can Russia westernize, trying to create this window on the west. Basically, that window on the west is St. Petersburg. Trying to have a place that can look out to the west, expand to the west, and create larger ties with the west. And that's what St. Petersburg did, one of those larger cities in Russia today. Catherine the Great also tried to expand upon Peter the Great's, looking towards the west, the type of things. She had a lot of efforts to change the country, especially getting that warm water port in in the southern area near Crimea. And the Bolsheviks also had a lot of power as they took over the country following the Russian Revolution. And statism, a powerful state, is something which a lot of Russians look to having. Civil society in Russia isn't as strong as, a larger state. The state of Russia is something which a lot of Russians look to having. And glasnost, something in the end of the Soviet Union, which Mikhail Gorbachev put into place, looking to expand Russians' freedoms, and well, all the people in the Soviet Union's freedoms. But this is something which began this modern idea of Russian freedom for individuals. Looking at the political and economic change in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church is something that's been around for over around 1,000 years. It has, been that major religious item of Russia. Began after some princes in the Kievan Rus went to, some people associated with that went to Constantinople, tried to get, affiliated with the Orthodox, closer ties, adopted the Orthodox religion of or the type of Orthodox part of Christianity, and began this. It went away from Russia for a while during the Soviet Union, as it was a lot more atheist in the Soviet Union, less religious. But Vladimir Putin has looked to expand this Russian Orthodox inside of Russia today, so that is something which is growing, and it has been a large part of Russian history. Tsar Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, of course, some of those more influential czars on westernizing Russia and making Russia what it is today. There was the Decembrist Revolt of 1825 when Napoleon invaded. Well, as you can see, it's important when it's a big note when these westernizing czars came to power. Russia wasn't really connected much with the West. Part of it was the religious ideas, being Orthodox, while the rest were other sects of Christianity, but also, not being really connected to the philosophical world. So when Enlightenment ideas came with Napoleon and such to Russia, when Napoleon invaded Russia, well, those ideas spread throughout some of the Russian population, and some intellectuals were not too happy with, the Russian state being very similar to a feudal society and such. Believed, there wasn't enough freedoms for people, and there should be reforms. So there was this Decembrist Revolt of 1825, which was shut down pretty quickly. Then there was the Crimean War. Following the Crimean War, it was found that, Russia was very backwards, and there would have to be a lot of reforms, for Russia if they wanted to be up to date as a modern empire. There were some of these reforms were freedom of the serfs and creation of local assemblies, which were called zemstvos. But eventually, in around the 1880s, those were removed as the population was not too happy. As you can see, Russia, over time, there's leadership, and then there's a revolution of something, and then there's someone else who goes into power for a long time. There's not a lot of change, which is really, or gradual change respect to Russia. So that's when when these large changes happen of adding the assemblies, well, some of the population might not be too happy with that. And then Marxists were, the idea of the power of the workers, really powerful in Russia in the 20th century. Vladimir Lenin, of course, being the Bolsheviks, being that early, what people would call a communist leader in Russia, or would become the Soviet Union. Democratic centralism, having that control, having that party, having that close leadership, centralized leadership to run the country, something large. The Bolsheviks, the Red Army, fought against the White Army, which were Allied powers, the government of Russia, just trying to keep Russia from becoming a communist country. However, there was new economic policy, more towards equality in Russia, which occurred under the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin, of course, one of those big leaders of that equality in the Soviet Union. Marxism, Leninism, towards that spreading out of equality, power for the workers. Nomenclatura, that going up in the Soviet Union, going up from local Soviet towards a more national government. However, there was, similar to China, communist governments, there's the Central Committee, all of the meetings at the top level communist leaders. Then there's a Politburo, which are the elite members of the Central Committee, and they are very powerful. And then you have the General Secretary getting picked from the Politburo, who is the general leader of the country. Joseph Stalin was one, and then they picked following that. That's just an example of one of the general secretaries, the main leader of the country. There was a lot of collectivization and industrialization. Those were some of the main focuses of Russia. Collective farming, trying to industrialize Russia, because as seen after the Crimean War, it was not even close to being industrialized as the West, and that's something Russia really tried to do during this time period: industrialize. There were collective farms instead of having what Joseph Stalin thought were, maybe not ineffective, but inefficient, were the smaller farms. So let's create these bigger collective farms, which had the idea of being more collective. There were kulaks who were upset with that. Well, if you're a farmer who's upset with this new idea and system, well, you're going to get shipped away to somewhere else, or you're going to not just gonna have to get, possibly even executed and such. You're just gonna get some punishment. If you put up a lot of resistance during this time period, just as Stalin, you're not going to. The end result's not going to be really good for you. There were the 5-year plans, which were these big plans to industrialize the country with energy, just to strengthen the Russian economy and, state in general, or the Soviet state, for that matter. There's the Gauss Plan, which was the central planning committee of the Soviet Union, which planned what resources would go where and how, as there was a lot of the command economy in the Soviet Union, the Gauss Plan had to decide what would be produced and where would it be distributed to. Stalinism, of course, seeing Joseph Stalin, this really harsh place where there was not a lot of room for dissent. Well, after following him, Nikita Khrushchev comes into power, gives a secret speech that Lenin, was not too fond of what Joseph Stalin was doing. So there's this push towards de-Stalinization in the country, not towards all these purges or all these, all this tight held society, some reforms in the way people could think and live. Well, following him, he was replaced with Leonid Brezhnev, who was a lot more of a conservative, try that tight hold on the Soviet Union, but there were 2 successors following him who were short-lived. But then there's Mikhail Gorbachev, who, of course, if you've heard his name before you know anything about him, you'd think of like this big reformer in the Soviet Union. And yes, he did a lot of reforms in the Soviet Union, not just economy-wise, but politically, allowing for some elections. And one of those elections for the president of the Republic of Russia, Boris Yeltsin did win that, and that would help him as eventually the Soviet Union does fall apart, and Boris Yeltsin becomes the president of Russia. Looking at the political culture and participation of Russia, nationalities, there are many of them in Russia. Sometimes they come into conflict. Looking at Chechnya, this is one of these examples where there is conflict between the population and Russia, and this isn't as big nationality-wise. It's kind of more religious. You have this area which follows a lot of Islam, and then you have like the Christian Russia, and even some atheists there. So there's a lot of conflict there. It's kind of a Chechnya. There were wars there in the 1990s, and eventually, Vladimir Putin got a lot of power, political support in Russia because he did defeat Chechnya, and got it back under control of Russia. And Chechnya kind of now is run, as kind of a separate country entity. I mean, it's still part of Russia. But, there's different rules and taxes and such which apply there. A lot of political culture, Marxism, Stalinism under the Soviet Union, those tight societies, leadership, the equality. Important question in Russia today, or even throughout Russian history, is this idea of Slavophile versus Westernizer. Do you keep it super Russian and not try to get too Westernized against? Do you want to get Westernized? Do you want to develop like with the Western world? So that's a big question in Russia. It has been for quite a while. Civil society in Russia, of course, is not as small as a result of the large ideas of statism and state corporatists, having the government run these groups for the different interests in society. Nashi is one of the groups Vladimir Putin created to have the youth, for youth. And it is pretty powerful. I mean, it did a lot of, I think it was Estonia, like it moved the Soviet monument, and there was a lot of, outrage from this country. They attacked like the embassy and such. So yeah, it's a pretty powerful group. Some of the political institutions inside of Russia is a federal government structure, where each of the states or autonomous regions, each of the basically regions in Russia have a lot of power. Asymmetric federalism also exists in Russia. Basically, some regions have more power than others. Important, there are around like 4 main political parties in Russia. One of them, of course, is the large, the one Vladimir Putin runs with, United Russia. It is, gains a lot of seats usually. But another one is the Liberal Democrats. Vladimir Zhirinovsky, was one of the prominent leaders in this group or in this political party, advocating the nuclear bombing of Japan and a lot of other nationalist things. So it's a super nationalist party in Russia. He was or has affiliations with the Liberal Democrats. Basically, they're the parties of power, which parties, can actually gain seats in Russia, which parties are just small and have like 1 seat. I think there's 2 of them. State currently. State corporatism, basically the state, having all that power centralized, controlling the groups and such. There's insider privatization, privatizing businesses. If you're with Putin, you can, the government can take, if you're against Putin, the government can take your business, but if you're, you can get charged and the business becomes property of the state. But if you're okay with him, or you're one of those oligarchs from the days of Boris Yeltsin, you can buy a wealthy company off of the government of Russia. Pravda was one of the important Soviet newspapers, which gave a lot of news that the government wanted to write, but now it's become much more of like a news on popular figures, less of like a super government propaganda piece. There's the head of state of Russia is the president, currently Vladimir Putin. The head of government is the prime minister. The Constitution of Russia, of course, in 1993 one. There were some amendments in 2020 to change the term limits to allow the president to run, I believe, 2 more terms of 6 years. Basically, Vladimir Putin can run for more terms, and if he wins each election he runs into, he's allowed to be president until 2036. That's the main change. The Duma, a lot of power. I believe there was 450 seats. 225 of the seats are done by proportional representation. Proportional representation, basically, where people will select political parties, and based on the political party that you're part of, you gain seats. And each political party has a list of people that would get elected depending on how many seats they won. And then the other 225 are single member districts. Basically, you vote for someone to represent your area of the country. Yeah. And there's the Constitutional Court, which is supposed to be the main court of the Soviet Union. Supposed to be rule of law, but there's issues between the government has a lot of control over the courts, and some certain leaders have too much power. A lot of the Constitutional Court trying to separate from the Russian government was done or not separate from the government, but to be independent. It was rumored for this group to move out of Moscow to go to St. Petersburg and to have a lot of power there. If you're not in Moscow, you can't be influenced a lot by the daily government positions, but if you're in St. Petersburg, you might have a lot more power. The KGB was an important police unit in the Soviet Union. Alexander Lebed, throughout the Soviet Union's history, there's not been a lot of military rule by someone in the military. The military has been a strong asset for ruling people to use, but a military leader hasn't gained a lot of power and controlled the country. Alexander Lebed, following the fall of the Soviet Union, was a candidate for president, a lot of military ties. So that's the only really close to maybe someone in the military going to take over part of the government. But that would have been through an election. Some of the current issues of Russia, perestroika, of course, the economic change. Russia, or it wasn't economic change, the Soviet Union with Mikhail Gorbachev. The Russian economy is just going up and down. Depends a lot of times on the price of oil, other global issues within the economy. So it's really suffers a lot. Of course, the current conflict in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine, causing the economy to change a lot with the sanctions and such from around the world. So it's an interesting topic. The Commonwealth of Independent States, former Soviet states who joined together or some of them who joined together to create better trade and more like a trade union and such, where the countries can trade between each other. And then, of course, just going back to the final thing, that statism. The Russian people throughout their history have loved a strong state, and that might be something that continues in Russia for the future.